My name is Audrey, and at 33 years old, I stood alone on a deserted dirt road in Connecticut, watching my stepmother drive away. It was exactly 2 hours after we lowered my father into the ground. As her black SUV disappeared into a cloud of thick gray dust, she truly believed she had finally destroyed me. She thought leaving me out there with no money, no phone, and no way home meant she had won the ultimate prize. But what Cassidy did not know was that I make a living hunting down corporate liars, and I had spent the last 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to stick around to hear how I turned her cruelest victory into her absolute financial ruin. The nightmare began earlier that morning at the cemetery. The November air was bitterly cold, cutting through my thin black coat as the priest delivered his final prayers. My father, William, was a titan in the commercial real estate world. He built an empire from the ground up, but his health had failed him rapidly over the last few months. Standing across from his grave was my stepmother, Cassidy. She was dressed in pristine designer mourning clothes, wiping away invisible tears for the benefit of the wealthy business partners in attendance. Beside her stood her biological son, Trent, looking completely bored as he checked his luxury watch. They were the picture of a grieving family, but I knew the truth. They had been waiting for this day for years. As the crowd began to disperse, Cassidy walked over to me. Her face was a mask of gentle maternal concern, but her eyes were cold and calculating. She reached out and touched my arm. "Audrey," she said softly, her voice projecting just enough for the remaining guests to hear. "I know we have had our differences, but your father would want us to be civil today. Let me give you a ride to the airport. It is the least I can do." I should have known better. I had not lived under their roof since I was 18, when Cassidy convinced my father to send me away so Trent could have the spotlight. I built my own life in New York City from scratch. I paid my own way through college and clawed my way to the top to become a senior forensic accountant. I uncover corporate fraud and money laundering for a living. I read people and I read numbers. But in a moment of grief, I made a mistake. I agreed to get in her car. The second the heavy doors of her luxury vehicle clicked locked, the grieving widow act vanished entirely. Cassidy stared straight ahead as she merged onto the highway, her jaw set in a hard line. We drove in suffocating silence for 40 minutes, heading away from the city and deep into the rural outskirts of the state. I noticed the scenery changing from highway exits to dense woods and empty fields. "Where are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "This is not the way to the airport." Cassidy did not answer immediately. Instead, she suddenly slammed her foot on the brakes. The heavy SUV swerved violently onto the shoulder of an abandoned logging road, kicking up a massive cloud of gravel and dirt. My seatbelt locked against my chest, knocking the breath out of me. Before I could even process what was happening, Cassidy threw the car into park and unbuckled her seatbelt. "Get out!" she snapped. Her voice was devoid of any emotion. I stared at her in disbelief. "We are miles from the highway, Cassidy. What are you doing?" I said, "Get out." She reached across the console, grabbed the handle of my passenger door, and shoved it open. The freezing autumn wind rushed into the heated cabin. With frightening speed, she grabbed my heavy suitcase from the back seat and hurled it out onto the muddy ground. Then she snatched my leather purse right off my lap. "Hey!" I shouted, grabbing for the strap, but she yanked it away. My phone, my wallet, and my identification were inside that bag. Cassidy looked me dead in the eye with a terrifying, victorious smirk. "This is where you get off, Audrey. You never belonged in our world anyway. The house, the money, and the business are all mine now. Do not bother coming to the reading of the will. You are getting absolutely nothing." She shoved my shoulder hard, forcing me backward out of the vehicle. My boots hit the wet dirt. Before I could regain my balance, she slammed the heavy car door shut and locked it. The engine roared as she slammed on the gas, speeding away and leaving me completely stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stood in the dust, shivering in the cold wind. Any normal person would have panicked. They would have cried or screamed or chased after the car. But I did none of those things. I just watched her taillights fade into the distance and allowed a small, cold smile to form on my lips. Cassidy thought I was still that helpless 18-year-old girl she threw out 15 years ago. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I knelt down in the dirt and grabbed my left boot. It was a custom-made leather boot designed specifically for my line of work. I dug my fingernail into a hidden seam near the thick heel and unzipped a concealed compartment. From the hollow sole, I pulled out two items: a fully charged encrypted satellite phone and a heavy black metal credit card. As a forensic accountant who deals with dangerous corporate criminals, I learned a long time ago never to leave my survival in a single handbag. I powered on the satellite phone and dialed a private number. It rang exactly twice before my assistant in New York answered. "I need a private extraction." I said, my voice steady and completely calm. "Send a helicopter to my current GPS coordinates immediately." "Understood, madam. Shall I have the pilot route you straight to the airport as planned?" I looked down the empty road and brushed the dirt off my black designer coat. "No," I replied. "Cancel my flight. Tell the pilot to take me directly to the law offices of my father's estate. I have a will reading to crash." I ended the call and slipped the heavy satellite phone back into the concealed compartment of my boot. The freezing Connecticut wind whipped my hair across my face, but I did not shield my eyes. I just stood there in the chilling silence, staring at the deep tire tracks Cassidy had left behind in the mud. She honestly thought this desolate road was my dead end. She thought stripping away my inheritance and leaving me stranded in the cold would break my spirit just like she tried to do 15 years ago. But she fundamentally misunderstood the woman she had just abandoned. When I was 18, Cassidy convinced my father that my ambitions were a liability to the family image. She whispered poison in his ear day after day, painting me as a rebellious, ungrateful child, while constantly propping up her biological son Trent as the dutiful, perfect heir. My father, whose mind was already clouding with the early signs of his illness, eventually surrendered to her relentless manipulation. I was given exactly 1 hour to pack a single bag. I was shoved out the massive oak doors of our luxury estate with nothing but a few $100s and the clothes on my back. I still remember the heavy metallic thud of that front door locking behind me. It was the sound of my family actively choosing to erase my existence. Most teenagers would have crumbled under that kind of rejection. I almost did. I slept in cheap motel rooms on the outskirts of the city and survived on instant noodles. But the anger burning inside my chest was a far better fuel than grief. I worked 3 exhausting jobs just to put myself through college. I studied late into the night until my vision blurred. I realized early on that the world is entirely run by money, and the people who control that money always leave a trail. That realization became my absolute obsession. I did not just want to build wealth. I wanted to understand the exact anatomy of greed. I wanted to know precisely how people like Cassidy dismantled the lives of others so I could learn how to dismantle them. That intense drive pushed me to the absolute top of my field. Today, I am the person federal agencies call when corrupt billionaires try to hide their stolen wealth. I am a senior forensic accountant. I spend my days tearing apart offshore shell companies, piercing corporate veils, and dragging financial criminals screaming into the light. My mind is a steel trap for numbers, anomalies, and hidden assets. I can trace a single misplaced decimal point through a dozen fake corporations straight to a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands. For the past decade, I had been quietly monitoring my father's commercial real estate company from the shadows. I watched Cassidy slowly and methodically tighten her grip on his assets while his health deteriorated. I watched her arrogant son Trent bleed the corporate accounts dry to fund his ridiculous luxury lifestyle and pay off his hidden gambling debts. I tracked their wire transfers, their inflated expense reports, and their fraudulent tax filings. I knew their dark financial secrets far better than they knew them themselves. They thought they were untouchable masterminds, but to me, they were just sloppy amateurs, leaving a massive paper trail of financial crimes. The distant rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors suddenly pulled me from my thoughts. The sound grew louder, echoing across the empty fields, until a sleek black private chopper appeared over the tree line, cutting sharply through the gray autumn sky. It hovered overhead for a brief moment before gracefully descending onto the deserted gravel road. The powerful downdraft sent a violent storm of dead leaves and dirt swirling into the air, whipping against my black coat. The side door slid open, revealing a security contractor in a dark uniform. He extended a gloved hand and pulled me up into the warm leather interior of the cabin over the deafening roar of the engine. I strapped myself into the luxury seat, brushing the road dust off my sleeves. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a quiet, soundproof bubble. From the front seat, the pilot turned around looking at me through his aviator glasses and headset. He tapped a few buttons on his navigation panel before glancing back. "We have clearance for takeoff and the flight plan is locked in," he said over the internal intercom. "JFK Airport, Mom." I leaned forward toward the glass partition, my voice cutting through the radio static with absolute icy clarity. "No, take me directly to my father's law firm. I have a will reading to crash." The flight from Connecticut to Manhattan took less than 30 minutes, but it gave me plenty of time to compose my thoughts. I watched the sprawling estates of the wealthy give way to the towering steel and glass canyons of the financial district. When the helicopter finally touched down on the private roof pad of the skyscraper, I did not hesitate. I stepped out into the biting wind and walked straight toward the executive elevator. I deliberately chose not to wash the dirt from my hands or brush the dried Connecticut mud from the hem of my coat. I wanted them to see exactly what they had tried to do to me, and I wanted them to know it had failed completely. The law offices of Harrison and Associates occupied the entire 50th floor of the building. It was a fortress of extreme wealth, decorated with polished mahogany floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and intimidating silence. I strode past the bewildered receptionist, completely ignoring her stammered protests, and marched directly down the main corridor. I knew exactly which room they would be in. The primary conference room was reserved exclusively for the firm's highest-paying clients. Through the frosted glass walls of the conference room, I could see the blurry silhouettes of my supposed family. I paused for just a second to listen. Cassidy's trembling theatrical voice drifted through the heavy doors. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, it was just terrible." Cassidy was sobbing, holding a delicate crystal flute of champagne in one hand and pressing a balled-up lace handkerchief to her dry cheek with the other. Audrey was so overcome with grief at the cemetery that she simply broke down. She ran off down the road, screaming that she never wanted to see any of us again. I tried to follow her in the car, but you know how deeply unstable she has always been. She refused to get in. "I think we should just proceed without her. William would have wanted us to handle his affairs quickly and quietly." I pushed the heavy oak doors open with enough force that they slammed hard against the walls. The sound echoed through the massive room like a gunshot. "That is a fascinating creative writing exercise, Cassidy," I said, stepping into the room. "But your timeline is a little off." The lawyer, an older man in a sharp gray suit, looked up over his reading glasses in absolute shock. Cassidy's fake tears instantly vanished. The color drained completely from her face as she stared at me like I was a demon rising from the grave. She lowered her handkerchief, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. Sitting next to her was Trent, leaning back in an expensive leather chair with his feet arrogantly propped up on the polished wood. He nearly choked on his champagne when he saw me. Sitting in the far corner looking completely detached from their morbid celebration was Naomi. She was Trent's wife, a brilliant corporate attorney, and a black woman who had endured years of Cassidy's subtle condescension and passive-aggressive racism. Naomi sat with her posture perfectly straight, her dark eyes analyzing everything in the room, while her husband completely ignored her presence. She was the only person who did not look surprised to see me. "I am not sure which woods you are referring to, Cassidy." I continued walking slowly toward the massive table. "But as you can see, I am perfectly stable, and I am absolutely ready to proceed." I pulled out the heavy leather chair directly opposite her and sat down, crossing my legs. I deliberately rested my mud-stained boots on the edge of the table right next to Trent's polished designer shoes, leaving a visible trail of dirt on the pristine wood. Trent quickly dropped his feet to the floor, his face flushing with anger. "You have a lot of nerve barging in here looking like a vagrant," he snapped, slamming his glass down. "This is a private legal proceeding. You should be removed by building security immediately." I turned my gaze to him, keeping my expression utterly blank. "This is the reading of my father's last will and testament, Trent. The only person sitting at this table who does not share a single drop of his blood is you. So if anyone is going to be escorted out by security, it will be the man drinking vintage champagne on the day of his stepfather's funeral." From the corner of my eye, I saw the faintest trace of a smirk cross Naomi's lips before she quickly masked it with a neutral, professional expression. She picked up her heavy silver pen and clicked it twice, a sharp metallic sound that seemed to slice right through the suffocating tension in the room. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat loudly, shuffling the thick stack of legal documents nervously in front of him. "Well," he began, his voice slightly shaky as he looked between me and Cassidy. "Now that all the primary beneficiaries are physically present, I suppose we can officially begin." He reached across his desk for a heavy brass letter opener. Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the table, and sneered at me. "Look who survived the hike," he whispered maliciously. "Let us get this over with so you can go back to whatever pathetic apartment you crawled out of." Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat one more time, and unsealed the heavy envelope containing my father's final wishes. The heavy parchment paper crackled loudly in the suffocating silence of the conference room. Mr. Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and began to read my father's final wishes. He bypassed the standard legal preamble and went straight to the distribution of the primary assets. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Cassidy sat leaning forward, her manicured hands tightly clasped on the polished mahogany table, her eyes fixed on the lawyer with hungry anticipation. To my wife, Cassidy, I leave my controlling interest, equating to 90% of the shares in the William Commercial Real Estate Group. This includes all operational authority over our current portfolio of 10 commercial properties located throughout the state. Cassidy let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, pressing her hand against her chest, as if she had just survived a terrible ordeal. She looked over at me with a sickeningly sweet smile of utter triumph. It was a corporate empire valued at over $150 million, handed over to a woman whose only actual business experience was spending other people's money. Mr. Harrison continued without pausing. "To my stepson, Trent, I leave the primary family residence located in Fairfield County, Connecticut, along with all its furnishings and the vehicles currently housed on the property." Trent pumped his fist slightly under the table, a smug grin spreading across his face. He had just inherited a $15 million mansion that he did not work a single day of his life to earn. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, looking at me like I was a peasant who had wandered into a royal court. Then the room fell completely silent. Mr. Harrison stopped reading. He looked down at the paper, then looked up at me with an expression of deep discomfort. He cleared his throat nervously and shifted in his seat. "And to my biological daughter, Audrey." Mr. Harrison read, his voice dropping an octave. "I leave a one-time cash disbursement of $10,000. Cassidy actually laughed out loud. She quickly covered her mouth, pretending to cough, but the sheer delight in her eyes was unmistakable. $10,000. In their world, that was the equivalent of pocket change. It was what Cassidy spent on a single weekend shopping trip in Paris. It was a calculated insult designed to remind me of exactly how little I meant to him. Mr. Harrison held up his hand to signal he was not finished. "There is one more item directed to Audrey," he said, reaching into his suit pocket. He pulled out a small sealed manila envelope and slid it across the long table toward me. "Furthermore, I leave Audrey the contents of Safety Deposit Box 818 at the main branch of Chase Bank in Manhattan. Included in this envelope is the physical key." I did not touch the envelope right away. I just stared at it. $10,000 and a mysterious box. Trent could no longer contain himself. He burst into loud, arrogant laughter, slapping the table with his hand. "Wow," he mocked, shaking his head. 10 grand and a rusty key to a metal box. That is poetry right there. You really hit the jackpot today, Audrey. With that 10 grand, you might finally be able to pay off a fraction of those pathetic student loans you are always working so hard to clear. I kept my face completely emotionless. As a forensic accountant, I knew better than to react to a provocation before I had all the data. A safety deposit box was a secure offline location. People did not use them to store worthless trinkets. They used them to hide things they did not want anyone else to find. You should take the money and be grateful. Trent continued, his voice dripping with condescension. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek designer money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and casually tossed it across the table. It fluttered through the air and landed right next to my mud-stained boots. Here is a little extra for cab fare back to whatever shoebox apartment you live in. We would not want you walking the streets of New York in those dirty shoes. Cassidy placed a hand softly on her son's arm, playing the role of the generous victor. Now, Trent, be kind. It is a difficult day for her. She turned her icy gaze to me. I think it is best if you leave now, Audrey. We have highly confidential corporate business to discuss with Mr. Harrison regarding the transition of my company. At the far end of the table, Naomi suddenly pushed her chair back. The harsh scraping sound against the hardwood floor drew everyone's attention. She stood up, smoothing the skirt of her immaculate designer suit. Her face was set in a mask of pure, cold disdain. She looked down at me with an expression of absolute disgust that sent a chill through the room. It is suffocating in here, Naomi said, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any sympathy. I am not going to sit around and watch the charity case beg for more scraps. I am leaving. Naomi grabbed her sleek leather briefcase from the floor and threw her designer coat over her arm. She did not look back at her husband or her mother-in-law. She simply began walking toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the conference room. To reach the exit, she had to walk directly past my chair. Cassidy let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head. You must excuse Naomi, Mr. Harrison, she said, waving her hand dismissively. She has always been overly dramatic, and frankly a bit unstable. Trent simply rolled his eyes, taking another long sip of his vintage champagne, completely ignoring his wife's departure. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead as Naomi approached. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor. As she drew level with my chair, she deliberately veered to the side. Her hip forcefully slammed into my shoulder. The impact was harsh and sudden, knocking me sideways and causing my arm to drop to my lap. Take your pennies and leave, Orphan Naomi snapped. Her voice was loud, echoing off the glass walls, dripping with such intense venom that Mr. Harrison actually jumped in his seat. It was the perfect distraction. In the exact fraction of a second when her body completely blocked the sightline of Cassidy and Trent, I felt something entirely different from hostility. Her hand brushed quickly and precisely against my open palm, resting on my leg. Her long, elegant fingers pressed a tiny square of folded paper firmly into my skin. My reflexes kicked in instantly. I closed my fist tight, concealing the paper before anyone could blink. I did not flinch. I did not look down. I played my part flawlessly. Watch where you are stepping, Naomi, I said, shooting her a cold, piercing glare. She simply scoffed, flipping her dark hair confidently over her shoulder. She pushed through the heavy oak doors, letting them slam shut behind her, leaving a tense silence in her wake. Trent laughed, shaking his head. Do not mind her, Audrey, he sneered. She just hates being in the same room as people who do not belong in our tax bracket. Now take your envelope and get out so we can discuss our real estate portfolio. I slowly stood up, slipping the small manila envelope containing the key to box 818 into my coat pocket. I looked down at the crisp $100 bill Trent had thrown at me. I did not pick it up. Instead, I took a deliberate step forward, bringing the heavy mud-stained heel of my boot down directly onto the center of the bill. I ground the dirt into the expensive carpet, leaving a permanent brown smear across Benjamin Franklin's face. Enjoy the house, Trent, I said, my voice dead calm. I hope you can afford the property taxes. I turned my back on them and walked out of the conference room. I strode down the long, quiet corridor of the law firm, my face completely blank. I bypassed the bewildered receptionist and pressed the button for the executive elevator. My heart was beating slightly faster now, but I controlled my breathing, keeping my exterior perfectly composed. The polished metal doors slid open, and I stepped inside. The moment the doors slid shut, sealing me alone in the quiet elevator car, I opened my tightly clenched fist. The tiny piece of paper was slightly crumpled from the heat of my palm. I carefully unfolded the thick white cardstock. It was a torn corner from a legal pad. The handwriting was sharp, precise, and written in heavy black ink. It contained exactly 2 sentences. The PIN for box 818 is your mother's death date. Check the Cayman Island accounts. The note was simply signed with a single capital letter N. I stared at the slip of paper as the elevator began its rapid descent down 50 floors. My mind instantly shifted into analytical overdrive. Naomi was the lead corporate attorney handling the transition of my father's company. If she knew about Cayman Island bank accounts, it meant she had seen the hidden ledgers. Cayman accounts were the ultimate red flag in my profession. They were offshore tax havens used by the ultra-wealthy to hide massive amounts of illicit money, dodge federal taxes, and launder stolen corporate funds. And if Naomi was feeding me the secure PIN to the safety deposit box, it meant my father had trusted her enough to give her the code before he died. He knew Cassidy would never let me near the will without a fight, so he planted a silent witness deep inside her own camp. Naomi was not just a disgruntled daughter-in-law acting out of spite. She was an inside operator. And she had just handed me the exact coordinates to blow Cassidy's entire financial empire to pieces. The elevator chimed loudly as it reached the lobby. The doors slid open, revealing the bustling Manhattan street outside. I pulled the encrypted satellite phone from my pocket and dialed my assistant back at my office. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," I said, stepping out into the cold city wind. "Prepare the secure servers and boot up the offshore tracking software. We are going hunting." I ended the call with my assistant and immediately hailed a black car to take me to the main branch of Chase Bank in Lower Manhattan. The drive took only 15 minutes, but my mind was racing through 1,000 different financial scenarios. A safety deposit box PIN tied to my mother. Offshore Cayman accounts. Naomi risking everything to hand me the keys. My father had known the end was coming, and he had meticulously prepared a financial battlefield for me. I paid the driver and stepped out into the freezing wind, looking up at the towering stone facade of the bank. I walked through the heavy revolving doors and approached the private client desk. I presented my identification and the physical key I had received at the law firm. The bank manager, a stern-looking man in a tailored suit, examined the credentials closely before giving me a polite nod. He escorted me to a private elevator that descended deep beneath the bustling city streets. When the doors opened, the air grew noticeably cooler. We walked down a long, silent corridor lined with thick steel vault doors. He led me into a massive room filled from floor to ceiling with thousands of polished metal boxes. "Box 818, he said, gesturing to a mid-sized compartment near the center of the wall. "Please enter the digital PIN on the keypad to disengage the secondary biometric lock." I stepped forward and typed in the 6 digits corresponding to the day my mother passed away. A soft green light blinked, and a heavy mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. The manager inserted his master key, turned it, and then stepped back, allowing me to insert my physical key. The heavy steel door swung open. He pulled out the long, rectangular metal container and carried it into a small private viewing room. He placed it on the polished oak table and discreetly closed the door, leaving me completely alone in the absolute silence of the subterranean vault. I took a slow, deep breath before reaching out and lifting the hinged lid of the metal box. Inside, there was no cash, no jewelry, and no sentimental photographs. There were only 2 thick manila folders resting neatly at the bottom. They were the tools of my trade. I reached in and pulled out the first folder. It was labeled Confidential Toxicology Report from an Independent Private Laboratory. I opened the cover and began to scan the dense medical data. My father had a severe heart condition and relied on a very specific daily medication to keep his heart rhythm stable. But as my eyes tracked down the columns of numbers highlighting his blood serum levels over his final 3 months, a sickening pattern emerged. The concentration of the life-saving drug had inexplicably plummeted. In its place were high traces of a heavy sedative that actively suppressed cardiac function. Someone had been systematically replacing his capsules, and only one person was responsible for administering his daily medications. Cassidy. The air in the tiny viewing room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Cassidy did not just manipulate my father into signing over his empire. She had actively orchestrated his death when he started asking too many questions about the company accounts. A cold, absolute fury settled deep into my bones. This was no longer just a financial dispute over an inheritance. This was a murder investigation, and I had the smoking gun right in my hands. I carefully set the toxicology report aside and picked up the second folder. It was surprisingly heavy bound with thick legal twine and stamped with an official state notary seal. I opened it and stared at the title page printed in bold black ink. It read, Blind Land Trust Agreement. As a forensic accountant, I deal with complex corporate structures every single day. I know exactly how to strip away the confusing legal jargon to find where the actual money is buried. I began flipping through the pages, scanning the core clauses, the transfer dates, and the beneficiary designations. The document was executed exactly 3 years ago, long before my father's mind began to fade. It detailed the creation of an ironclad, irrevocable trust designed to hold real estate assets in complete secrecy. I followed the asset schedules listed in the back of the document, mapping the properties to the corporate structures I knew my father owned. Then I read the final execution clause, and all the breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. I had to read the paragraph 3 times to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The William Commercial Real Estate Group, the company Cassidy had just inherited, owned 10 massive skyscrapers in Connecticut. But according to this legal document, the company did not own the actual dirt those skyscrapers were built on. My father had quietly severed the land from the buildings and transferred the ground titles directly into this blind trust. And the sole beneficiary and executor of that trust was me. Cassidy owned the bricks, but I owned the earth beneath them. My father did not leave me nothing. He left me the master key to everything. While I was sitting in that underground bank vault holding the key to her total destruction, Cassidy was busy measuring the drapes in my father's corner office. She had wasted absolutely no time. The ink on the death certificate was barely dry before she moved her imported leather furniture into the executive suite on the top floor of the William Commercial Real Estate Group. She sat behind his massive mahogany desk, spinning in his heavy leather chair and sipping a glass of expensive champagne. The feeling of absolute power was intoxicating to her. She had spent the last decade playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife. Now she was finally the undisputed queen of the castle. The very first order of business on her agenda was a complete corporate purge. She pressed the silver intercom button and summoned the head of human resources. Cassidy handed over a thick stack of termination notices she had prepared weeks in advance. Within 2 hours, she had systematically fired every single loyal executive my father had employed for the last 20 years. The chief financial officer, the vice president of operations, and the entire senior advisory team were all handed cheap cardboard boxes. They were escorted out of the glass building by armed security guards in front of the entire staff. Cassidy did not want anyone around who actually knew how to read a balance sheet or question a missing invoice. She immediately replaced the seasoned executives with a team of highly paid sycophants. Their only job was to blindly approve her fraudulent expense reports and prepare the company for a massive buyout. She had secretly brokered a deal to sell the entire commercial real estate portfolio to a global megacorporation for $120 million. The historic merger was scheduled to be signed at a lavish gala in just a few weeks. All she had to do was keep the corporate shell looking highly profitable until the buyers signed the final contract. Just as she was admiring her new kingdom, the heavy glass doors to the office swung open. Trent strolled in, twirling a shiny set of keys on his finger. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, acting as if he had built the entire company with his own 2 hands. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and pointed down at the busy Manhattan street below. "Take a look at the new company car, Mother," he said, a massive, arrogant grin spreading across his face. Cassidy stood up and walked over to the window. Parked illegally in the executive loading zone directly blocking the main entrance was a brand new cherry red Ferrari. It gleamed aggressively in the afternoon sun, drawing stares from everyone walking by. It was a $400,000 machine, purchased purely for vanity. "Tell me you did not use the corporate operating account to buy that car, Trent," she scolded him, but her voice lacked any real authority. "We need the cash reserves to look completely solid for the acquisition audit. The buyers are sending their people to review the books next week." Trent simply waved his hand dismissively and threw his coat onto the leather sofa. "Relax, mother. I set it up as a long-term corporate lease under the marketing and promotional budget. It is a total tax write-off. Besides, the mega corporation is going to hand us $120 million in less than a month. We are burning through some cash now, but the payoff will cover everything. What does a sports car matter in the grand scheme of things? We won. We own everything now." Cassidy sighed and smiled, shaking her head affectionately at her spoiled son. She never could tell him no. "You need to be more careful, Trent. Naomi is already asking questions about the missing funds from the escrow accounts. Your wife is a brilliant corporate attorney. She handles all our internal contracts. She is definitely not stupid, and I do not trust her." Trent laughed out loud, pouring himself a large glass of champagne from the crystal bottle on the desk. "Naomi does whatever I tell her to do," he sneered, taking a long drink. "She knows her place in this family. She is just lucky I married her and pulled her out of that miserable public defender office. She will keep her mouth shut and process the merger paperwork just like a good little employee. If she gives me any trouble, I will just cut off her credit cards." Cassidy nodded slowly, returning to her desk feeling completely invincible. She had successfully eliminated my father without raising any police suspicion. She had easily discarded me, leaving me stranded in the dirt with absolutely nothing. She was just weeks away from cashing a 9-figure check and disappearing into a life of unimaginable luxury. Nothing could possibly touch her now. She opened her private laptop to check the balance of her personal offshore accounts. She wanted to verify that the latest massive wire transfer from the corporate reserve had safely cleared into her hidden Cayman Islands trust. She clicked the encrypted banking icon on her desktop and entered her secure 16-digit password. But instead of the familiar digital ledger displaying her stolen millions, a bright red warning banner flashed aggressively across the center of her screen. The alarm was silent, but the message was absolutely deafening. It was a high-priority security alert from the private banking server. "Breach detected. Unauthorized external forensic audit in progress. Active data download initiated." Cassidy's heart completely stopped. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered violently on the hardwood floor. Someone was actively bypassing the advanced firewall of her offshore account. Someone was systematically downloading 5 years' worth of forged financial records, illegal wire transfers, and hidden assets. And they were doing it right now. I sat in the center of my darkened Manhattan apartment, illuminated only by the cold blue light of 6 oversized computer monitors. The security breach alert that was currently giving Cassidy a heart attack in Connecticut was entirely my doing. I had bypassed her offshore banking firewall in under 12 minutes. For someone who thought she was a criminal mastermind, she used shockingly basic encryption. I watched the progress bar on my center screen hit 100%, as 5 years of her heavily guarded financial history flooded onto my secure servers. I took a sip of black coffee and cracked my knuckles. It was time to go to work. I pulled up the primary ledger for the William Commercial Real Estate Group on my left screen and cross-referenced it with Cassidy's private Cayman Islands Trust on my right. As a forensic accountant, I do not just look at raw numbers. I look for the story the numbers are desperately trying to hide. Fraud always leaves a signature. I began to track the digital footprints of every single dollar that had moved through my father's company since his health started declining. I ran automated scripts to highlight anomalies in vendor payments, offshore wire transfers, and sudden spikes in operational expenses. The pattern emerged almost instantly, painting a picture of absolute corporate rot. Cassidy was not just stealing from the company, she was executing a highly coordinated financial shell game. I traced a series of massive wire transfers disguised as payments to independent contractors for property maintenance, structural upgrades, and luxury renovations. But when I ran the tax identification numbers for those supposed contractors, they all looped back to a single hollow holding company registered in Delaware. A company that was wholly owned by Trent. They were bleeding the corporate operating budget dry and funneling the cash directly into their own pockets to fund his luxury cars and her endless designer lifestyle. But petty embezzlement was not enough to put them away for life. I needed to see the bigger picture. I widened my search parameters, digging into the corporate valuation reports filed just 3 weeks ago. That is when I found the heavily guarded prospectus for the upcoming mega merger. Cassidy was preparing to sell the entire commercial portfolio to a global investment firm for $120 million. The signing was scheduled for a massive gala in just a few weeks. My eyes darted across the projected revenue columns, and the truth suddenly clicked into place. She was not just hiding her theft. She was cooking the books to artificially inflate the value of the company before the sale. By categorizing their stolen millions as capital improvements and falsifying tenant rental yields, Cassidy was making the real estate group look twice as profitable as it actually was. It was a classic pump and dump scheme on a massive corporate scale. If she successfully signed that merger contract, she would walk away with a 9-figure payout, and the buying corporation would be left holding a worthless, hollowed-out shell wrapped in massive hidden debt. The digital evidence I had just acquired was damning, but I knew how the legal system worked. In a federal court, high-priced defense lawyers could argue that these were simply accounting errors or mismanaged funds authorized by my late father. To trigger an immediate raid by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and completely destroy the merger, I needed more than just digital spreadsheets. I needed undeniable physical proof of intent. I needed the internal corporate authorizations. I needed the documents bearing Cassidy's forged signatures and Trent's fraudulent approvals. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the wall of glowing data. Those physical contracts were locked away in the highly secure human resources and legal departments at the company headquarters. If I tried to hack into the internal corporate mainframe to get them, the system would immediately alert Cassidy, and she would shred the physical files before I could even file a police report. I needed someone on the inside. Someone with high-level security clearance who handled the company contracts every single day. Someone who already hated Cassidy and Trent just as much as I did. I picked up my encrypted satellite phone from the desk. I opened a secure messaging application that routed through 3 different international proxy servers, making the communication completely untraceable. I typed in the number from the tiny folded note I had received at the law firm earlier that afternoon. I kept the message incredibly brief and straight to the point. I have the offshore accounts, but I need the wet signatures on the internal Delaware contracts. Name the time and place. I hit send and watched the encrypted text fly silently through the digital void straight to Naomi. I parked my unmarked rental car 2 blocks away from a rundown diner on the dark industrial edge of the city. The neon sign buzzed loudly above the entrance, casting a flickering red glow over the wet pavement. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and walked inside. The smell of stale coffee and cheap fried food hit me instantly. The place was completely empty, except for one person sitting in the very back booth, hidden in the shadows. Naomi was wearing a dark, heavy trench coat over her expensive tailored suit. Her posture was completely rigid, her eyes rapidly scanning the dark parking lot through the greasy window. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from her. She did not bother with any polite pleasantries. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked, her voice low and incredibly tight. I shook my head, resting my hands on the table. I took 3 different subway lines and a cash cab before I rented a car under a false name. "We are completely clean, Naomi. Nobody knows we are here." Naomi exhaled slowly, the intense tension in her shoulders dropping just a fraction. She reached deep into her coat pocket, but kept her hand hidden beneath the table. I looked at her, studying the deep exhaustion behind her sharp, intelligent eyes. "Why are you doing this, Naomi?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You are legally married to Trent. If Cassidy goes down and the entire company collapses, Trent loses absolutely everything. That means you lose everything too. You are the lead corporate attorney for the firm. You could have just walked away and kept your hands entirely clean. Naomi let out a bitter, hollow laugh that did not reach her eyes. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the sticky table. You actually think I care about Trent's money, Audrey? You think I want any part of that poisoned blood money? Let me tell you exactly what my life has been like for the past 5 years, trapped inside your stepmother's perfect little white picket fence empire. I stayed completely silent, letting her speak. I graduated at the absolute top of my class from Columbia Law. Naomi continued, her voice hardening with absolute surgical precision. I am a brilliant corporate attorney, but to Cassidy and Trent, I am nothing but a convenient prop. I am the diversity hire they parade around when the board members ask uncomfortable questions about corporate culture. And behind closed doors, I am treated like the absolute help. She looked down at her hands, shaking her head slowly. Do you know how many times Cassidy has asked me to fetch her coat or pour coffee for the junior executives at senior board meetings? Do you know how many times she has complimented me on being so remarkably articulate for someone of my background? The daily microaggressions, the constant condescension, the subtle racism woven into every single interaction in that house. Trent never once defends me. He just laughs along and tells me to stop being so overly sensitive. He married me because he liked the idea of a smart, beautiful black wife on his arm to make him look modern and progressive. But in reality, he expects me to be his obedient little servant. I felt a cold, hard knot of anger form deep in my stomach. I knew Cassidy was an absolute monster, but hearing the systematic psychological abuse she inflicted on Naomi made me want to burn her corporate empire down even faster. I spent the first 2 years trying to prove my actual worth. Naomi said, her eyes burning with fierce, unapologetic intensity. I thought if I just worked harder, if I drafted the most airtight corporate contracts, if I saved them millions in legal loopholes, they would finally respect my intellect. But then your father got sick. And I saw exactly what Cassidy was planning to do to you and to the company. Naomi finally pulled her hand from beneath the table. She placed a small black encrypted flash drive on the scratched Formica surface right between us. When Cassidy started creating those fake Delaware holding companies, she needed someone to draft the legal framework, Naomi explained, tapping the flash drive with her polished fingernail. She thought I was just a highly paid secretary who would blindly process the paperwork without ever asking any questions. She thought I was too intimidated by her to read the fine print. But I read every single word, Audrey. I tracked every single dollar. I looked down at the tiny piece of plastic holding the absolute key to their total destruction. What exactly is on this drive? I asked. Everything, Naomi replied, without missing a single beat. Every fraudulent expense report. Every illegal wire authorization sent to the Cayman Islands. But most importantly, it contains the high-resolution optical scans of every single wet signature Cassidy and Trent put on those illegal contracts. There is no digital manipulation. There is no plausible deniability. I personally scanned the original physical documents before filing them in the corporate vault. It proves clear malicious intent to defraud the shareholders and artificially inflate the company valuation before the mega merger. I slowly reached out and picked up the flash drive. It felt incredibly heavy in my hand. This is more than enough to trigger a federal raid, I said, my mind already calculating the precise legal trajectory. The authorities will tear the company headquarters apart before the merger contract is ever signed. Naomi leaned back in the vinyl booth, a look of profound relief washing over her face. She had carried this toxic secret for years, and now she was finally handing the burden over to someone who could actually destroy the monster who created it. I have given you the offshore accounts, and now I have given you the physical proof, Naomi said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. This is the bullet, Audrey. Now you just need to pull the trigger. I left the diner with the flash drive securely tucked into the hidden pocket of my coat. The cold night air felt different now. It felt like absolute victory. I drove back to my secure apartment in Manhattan, locked the heavy deadbolts behind me, and immediately booted up my primary workstation. When I inserted the drive, the decryption software ran for a few tense seconds before the files populated across my monitors. Naomi had delivered exactly what she promised. There, in crisp, high-resolution optical scans, were the physical contracts. Cassidy and Trent had signed their names in bold blue ink right next to the fraudulent financial declarations. It was the undeniable physical proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. I spent the next 4 hours building the perfect digital execution file. As a senior forensic accountant, I knew exactly how federal prosecutors liked their evidence packaged. I did not just send them raw data. I built a comprehensive timeline cross-referencing the forged signatures with the offshore Cayman Island wire transfers and the artificially inflated corporate valuations. I laid out the entire $120 million pump and dump scheme so clearly that a first-year law student could have won the conviction. At exactly 2 in the morning, I opened a secure, encrypted communication channel to a senior director I frequently worked with at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. I attached the massive data packet along with a secondary secure file directed to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit. I typed a brief message. Here is the complete evidence package for wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement at the William Commercial Real Estate Group. The flight risk is extremely high. I recommend freezing all associated accounts immediately upon execution of warrants. I hit send and watched the progress bar turn green. The trap was officially set. While I was meticulously dismantling her entire life, Cassidy was busy planning the party of the century. Over the next week, the corporate world was buzzing with the news of the upcoming mega-merger. Cassidy had officially announced that the global investment firm had agreed to the $120 million buyout. But simply signing the documents in a quiet boardroom was not enough for her massive ego. She needed an audience. She needed everyone in her wealthy social circle to witness her ultimate triumph. She rented out the grand ballroom at a luxury hotel, sparing absolutely no expense. She ordered thousands of imported white orchids, hired a world-renowned symphony orchestra, and invited every major business reporter in the city to cover the historic signing ceremony. Trent was already giving arrogant statements to the press, posing for magazine covers, and talking about his brilliant future as an independent venture capitalist. They were completely blinded by their own greed, utterly unaware that the federal government was quietly building a massive steel cage around their entire empire. 4 days before the scheduled event, a bonded courier knocked on the door of my apartment. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive cream-colored cardstock, sealed with custom gold wax. I took it back to my kitchen counter and broke the seal. Inside was a VIP all-access pass to the merger gala. Cassidy simply could not resist the urge to be cruel. She had gone out of her way to track down my secure address, just to twist the knife one last time. Clipped to the glossy invitation was a handwritten note on her personal stationery. The handwriting was elegant, but the message was pure venom. Audrey, I thought you should be there to witness history. Come watch me sell your daddy's legacy. Wear something nice for the cameras. Cassidy. I stared at the note, feeling a deep, cold calm wash over me. She wanted to humiliate me on the biggest stage possible. She wanted me to stand in the back of the room and watch her walk away with my father's empire, while the cameras flashed, and the elite applauded her genius. She had built a magnificent towering pedestal for herself right in the center of New York City. She just did not realize I had already planted the explosives at the base. I picked up my thick black pen, I flipped the elegant RSVP card over, and pressed the ink firmly into the expensive paper. I checked the box that indicated I would be attending. Underneath it, I wrote a very short reply, RSVP, yes, I would not miss the grand finale for the world. I slid the card back into the envelope and dropped it in the outgoing mail. Then I walked over to my closet to pick out the perfect power suit. If Cassidy wanted a show, I was going to give her a spectacular one. 3 days before the grand merger gala, the pressure was finally starting to fracture Trent's arrogant facade. While Cassidy was busy micromanaging the floral arrangements for her moment of glory, her son was locked inside his expansive new office, sweating through his custom-tailored silk shirt. His burner phone, sitting on the heavy mahogany desk, had been vibrating relentlessly since 8 in the morning. He ignored the first 5 calls, but the text messages that followed were impossible to ignore. They were from a very dangerous syndicate of high-stakes bookies operating out of Atlantic City. Trent had a severe gambling addiction that he had carefully hidden from his mother for years. He had bet heavily on underground sports syndicates, assuming the corporate merger money would arrive in time to cover his massive losses. But the bookies were done waiting. The final message was painfully clear. He owed $2.5 million by midnight, or they were going to pay a highly publicized visit to the gala. Trent paced the length of his office, frantically running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was completely trapped. He had already drained his personal trust fund to buy the Ferrari and fund his extravagant lifestyle. The corporate reserve accounts were locked down tightly pending the final merger audit. If he asked Cassidy for the money, she would absolutely lose her mind and potentially cut him out of the new venture entirely. The heavy glass door to his office quietly clicked open. Naomi walked in carrying a stack of legal folders. She took one look at his pale, panicked face and instantly knew the trap was primed. She had been monitoring his frantic phone activity all morning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She closed the door behind her and walked over to his desk, her expression perfectly molded into one of gentle, wifely concern. "You look terrible, Trent," she said softly, setting the folders down. "Is everything all right with the acquisition paperwork?" Trent jumped slightly, his eyes darting to his vibrating phone. "Everything is fine," he snapped defensively, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Just dealing with some minor operational delays. Nothing you need to worry about." Naomi walked around the desk and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You know you can talk to me," she murmured, keeping her voice smooth and entirely unthreatening. "I am the lead corporate attorney. If there is a sudden cash flow issue with one of our vendors or a temporary liquidity problem, I can draft a short-term internal promissory note. It is a completely standard procedure. We use the corporate operating capital as a bridge loan and repay it the second the merger funds clear on Friday. No one ever has to know." Trent froze. He looked up at her, his panicked mind desperately grasping at the lifeline she had just casually tossed into the water. A short-term internal loan. It sounded so clean, so professional. "Are you saying I could authorize a direct wire transfer from the holding company accounts today?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly with desperate hope. "Without triggering an automatic board review?" Naomi smiled warmly, nodding her head. "Exactly. As long as you categorize it under the emergency structural renovation budget for the Delaware properties, the automated accounting software will process it as a standard vendor payment. I can even generate the vendor invoice for you right now, so the paper trail looks completely legitimate. You just have to sign the wire authorization. By the time the auditors review the quarterly reports next month, the $120 million buyout will have deposited, and you can quietly replace the funds." It was a masterful psychological manipulation. She was handing him the exact weapon he needed to destroy himself while making him believe it was a shield. Trent let out a massive sigh of relief, a smug, arrogant smile returning to his face. He actually leaned forward and kissed her hand, completely oblivious to the cold calculation in her eyes. "You are a lifesaver, Naomi," he breathed, opening his laptop and logging into the secure corporate banking portal. "Draft that invoice immediately. I need to move $2.5 million right now." Naomi stepped back, allowing him clear access to the keyboard. She watched with cold satisfaction as he frantically typed in the offshore routing numbers the bookies had provided. He did not hesitate. He did not double-check the legal ramifications. His greed and fear completely blinded him to the massive digital footprint he was leaving behind. He navigated to the final authorization screen. The system prompted him for his unique biometric thumbprint and his digital signature to release the millions. Trent pressed his thumb against the scanner and confidently typed his name into the authorization box. He clicked the bright green button to execute the wire transfer. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a loud, victorious laugh. "Done," he declared, closing the laptop. "Problem solved." But the problem was not solved. It was just beginning. Because the moment Trent clicked that button, the money did not just quietly move to Atlantic City. Down in Washington District of Columbia, a massive red alert instantly illuminated the primary monitoring screens at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. The wire transfer had tripped the exact surveillance wire I had set up with the federal agents. The final nail had just been driven into his coffin. Friday evening arrived with a chilling wind, but the atmosphere outside the Plaza Hotel was blazing with electricity. Cassidy had transformed the historic New York venue into a massive monument dedicated entirely to her own ego. Searchlights swept across the dark skyline, while a thick red carpet stretched all the way down the marble steps toward Fifth Avenue. A frantic swarm of photographers and financial reporters fought against the velvet ropes, waiting to catch a glimpse of the woman who was about to close the biggest commercial real estate deal of the decade. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the loud, chaotic shouting of the paparazzi. Inside the grand foyer, the scene was even more obnoxious. Cassidy was already holding court among the city elite. She was dripping in millions of dollars worth of borrowed diamonds and wearing a custom silver gown that caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers. She laughed loudly with the executives from the purchasing megacorporation, playing the role of the brilliant grieving widow turned corporate titan to absolute perfection. Waiters circled the room carrying silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. Cassidy felt completely untouchable. The ink on the merger documents was practically dry in her mind, and she firmly believed she had outsmarted everyone, including the federal government. Standing a few feet away from her, Trent was painting a very different picture. Despite wearing an immaculate tailored tuxedo, he looked physically ill. He was sweating profusely, continually dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief and aggressively downing glass after glass of champagne. He kept looking nervously over his shoulder toward the main entrance, terrified that the Atlantic City Syndicate was going to walk through the doors at any second to collect their $2.5 million. He had no idea that the wire transfer he authorized had already sealed his fate. Miles away in my quiet apartment, I stood in front of a full-length mirror and made my final adjustments. I was not going to show up to this battlefield looking like a victim begging for scraps. I had commissioned a custom power suit gown specifically for this occasion. It was a sharp, tailored masterpiece of midnight black silk. The structured blazer bodice featured sharp, aggressive shoulders that flowed seamlessly into a sweeping floor-length skirt. The subtle gold accents caught the light like armor. I tied my dark hair back into a sleek, uncompromising knot. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry. My confidence and the devastating secrets I carried were the only accessories I needed. I slid into the back of a private town car and gave the driver the address. As we navigated through the heavy Manhattan traffic, my encrypted phone buzzed with a final confirmation message from my contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The arrest warrants were officially signed by a federal judge. The tactical teams were already in position, discreetly waiting in unmarked vans around the perimeter of the hotel. All I had to do was walk in there, drop the match, and watch the entire corrupt empire burn to the ground. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. The town car pulled up to the curb at the plaza, and the moment my driver opened the door, the flashbulbs erupted. The paparazzi did not know exactly who I was, but they recognized absolute power when they saw it. I stepped out onto the red carpet, the cold wind catching the edge of my silk skirt. I ignored the shouted questions from the reporters and walked purposefully up the marble stairs. Every step I took felt like a hammer striking the final nails into Cassidy's coffin. As I reached the heavy brass doors at the top of the steps, two massive security guards in dark suits suddenly stepped directly into my path. They crossed their arms, forming a solid human wall blocking the entrance to the grand ballroom. "Excuse me, ma'am," the taller guard said, holding up a thick hand to stop my momentum. "We have strict orders from the host. You are not on the approved guest list. You need to turn around and leave the premises immediately." I did not take a single step back. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with gold wax. I held it up right in front of the guard's face. "I have a VIP all-access pass specifically signed by Cassidy herself," I said, my voice cold and loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear. "Step aside." The guard frowned, glancing at the invitation, but he did not move a muscle. My orders were updated 10 minutes ago, he growled. The pass is revoked. Cassidy instructed us to have you forcefully removed if you caused a scene. I was just about to escalate the situation when the heavy brass doors swung open from the inside. Naomi stepped out onto the landing looking absolutely stunning in a deep emerald green dress. She held a clipboard in one hand and her heavy silver pen in the other. She looked the towering security guard up and down with an expression of pure lethal authority. "Stand down." "Higgins," Naomi commanded, her voice echoing sharply across the stone landing, cutting through the noise of the paparazzi. "As the lead legal counsel for the William Commercial Real Estate Group, I am officially overriding that order. This woman is a primary shareholder and my personal guest. Open the doors and let her inside right now." I stepped past the bewildered security guards and walked through the heavy brass doors into the magnificent foyer of the Plaza Hotel. Naomi did not say a single word to me. We did not even exchange a smile. She simply gave a curt professional nod and turned her attention back to her clipboard, playing her role perfectly. The level of discipline she possessed was staggering. I walked past her and entered the massive reception area outside the main ballroom. The lobby was a sprawling sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. The air hummed with the arrogant chatter of the city elite, layered over the soft classical music drifting from the ballroom. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and stood near a towering marble pillar, taking a moment to observe the room. It did not take long for the golden boy to spot me. Trent was standing near the sweeping grand staircase, surrounded by 4 older men in immaculately tailored suits. I recognized them immediately. They were the remaining independent board members of the William Commercial Real Estate Group, the men who supposedly provided financial oversight for the company. Trent was laughing loudly, holding a half-empty glass of vintage champagne. His face was flushed red from a combination of alcohol and extreme stress, but he was desperately trying to play the part of the confident young executive. He caught sight of my black silk gown. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, before twisting into a nasty sneer. He whispered something to the board members and gestured in my direction. The group turned to look at me, and Trent began leading them across the polished marble floor right toward my pillar. He wanted an audience. He wanted to publicly crush me to inflate his own fragile ego. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Trent announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "I am honestly amazed they let you pass the front door, Audrey. Did you rent that dress? Or did you find it in a thrift store on your side of town?" The board members chuckled politely, shifting their weight. One of them, an older man with silver hair, spoke up. "Trent, who is this young woman?" "This is my late stepfather's estranged daughter," Trent replied, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his champagne. "She was cut out of the will for being completely unstable and financially irresponsible. She probably came here hoping to beg for a handout before we signed the $120 million merger. It is actually incredibly pathetic." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with Trent. "I am not here for a handout, Trent. I am just here to admire the financial genius of the man who manages to spend millions of dollars he does not actually have." Trent scoffed, rolling his eyes at the board members. "See what I mean? She is completely delusional." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. My voice was low but razor sharp. "Delusional is using the corporate marketing and promotional budget to execute a $400,000 long-term lease on a cherry red Ferrari. It is a bold move, Trent, especially when the company is supposedly in a strict spending freeze pending a massive acquisition audit." The smiles instantly vanished from the faces of the board members. The silver-haired man frowned, looking sharply at Trent. "A $400,000 lease. Trent, what exactly is she talking about?" Trent's face drained of color. He gripped his champagne glass so tightly, I thought the delicate crystal might shatter in his hand. "She is lying," he stammered, a heavy bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "She is just a bitter orphan, making things up to cause a scene." I did not raise my voice, but the sheer authority in my tone cut through the lobby chatter like a knife. I am not lying about the Ferrari, and I am certainly not lying about the $2.5 million wire transfer you authorized this morning from the corporate holding accounts. I watched his eyes widen in absolute terror as I recited the exact routing numbers from memory. You categorized it as an emergency structural renovation for the Delaware properties. But we both know that money went straight to an offshore account, controlled by an Atlantic City sports betting syndicate, to cover your massive gambling debts. You are bleeding the company dry just hours before the biggest merger in its history. The silence that fell over the small group was completely deafening. The board members stared at Trent in absolute shock, their expressions morphing from polite amusement to profound horror. The silver-haired man stepped back, shaking his head in total disbelief. $2.5 million, he whispered, his voice trembling with fury. Trent, tell me right now that this woman is lying. Tell me you did not steal company funds. Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest heaved with panic as the walls closed in around him. Without saying a single word, he violently shoved past the board members, dropping his champagne glass onto the marble floor, where it shattered into 100 pieces. He stormed off into the crowded ballroom, desperately searching for his mother. I watched Trent disappear into the sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits, leaving the board members staring at the shattered crystal on the marble floor. I did not wait around to answer their frantic questions or watch the fallout of his panic. I had a much bigger target to hit, and the clock was rapidly ticking down to 0. I slipped away from the marble pillar and navigated through the outer perimeter of the crowded lobby, heading directly toward the restricted access corridors. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the sounds of the party as I stepped into the dimly lit hallway. Naomi had conveniently left the service elevator unlocked for me, which was a crucial part of our strategy. I stepped inside the metal box and pressed the button for the mezzanine level. This floor housed the primary audiovisual control booth, a secure room that commanded the lighting, sound, and projection systems for the entire grand ballroom. I needed absolute control of the environment to execute the final phase of my plan. The control booth was completely empty, just as Naomi promised it would be. The hotel technicians were all down on the main floor, managing the complex camera setups and lighting rigs for the massive press pool. I locked the heavy acoustic door behind me and walked up to the massive soundproof glass window. From this elevated vantage point, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. It was a breathtaking display of excessive corporate wealth designed specifically to blind the buyers with sheer glamour. Thousands of rare white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, and a massive symphony orchestra played softly in the corner of the room. But my eyes were fixed entirely on the brightly lit stage, positioned at the very center of the floor. Cassidy was standing behind a beautifully carved mahogany podium, looking like a reigning monarch. Beside her stood 3 senior executives from the global investment firm, looking incredibly pleased with the historic acquisition they were about to finalize. Resting directly in the center of the podium was the massive leather-bound merger contract. It was the physical manifestation of a $120 million payout. Cassidy was beaming, posing gracefully for the swarm of photographers crowded around the base of the stage. She was completely intoxicated by the flashing lights and the roaring applause, basking in the artificial adoration. She truly believed she had successfully erased my father and stolen his legacy without facing a single consequence. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Trent. He was forcefully pushing his way through the dense crowd of reporters at the front of the stage, causing a noticeable disruption. His tailored tuxedo jacket was completely unbuttoned, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. A security guard actually had to put a heavy hand on his chest to stop him from physically climbing onto the platform. Trent waved frantically at his mother, desperately trying to get her attention. Cassidy finally noticed the commotion, but she just shot him a furious warning glare. She waved him off with a subtle flick of her wrist, keeping her perfect, brilliant smile locked directly onto the camera lenses. She was entirely consumed by her own vanity, refusing to let her son's sudden panic interrupt her coronation. The lead executive from the purchasing firm stepped up to the microphone. He delivered a short, glowing speech about the future of commercial real estate and the brilliant legacy of the William Commercial Real Estate Group. He praised Cassidy for her steady leadership and her sharp business acumen during a difficult transition period. Every single word he spoke made my blood boil, but I kept my hands perfectly steady. I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out the encrypted flash drive Naomi had given me at the diner. I plugged it directly into the primary projection console and booted up the presentation file I had meticulously prepared. I bypassed the standard hotel network and linked my feed directly into the massive digital projectors suspended from the ceiling. The system synced instantly, giving me total command over the enormous screens positioned directly behind the stage. Down on the floor, the executive finished his speech to a round of enthusiastic applause. He turned to Cassidy and gestured gracefully toward the open contract. Cassidy stepped forward, practically glowing with absolute triumph. A legal assistant handed her a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. The room grew quiet as the press pool readied their cameras for the historic shot. Cassidy looked out over the crowd, savoring the absolute peak of her power. She lowered her head, bringing the gold nib of the pen down toward the thick parchment paper. I reached forward and firmly pressed the master override button on the audio mixing board. I grabbed the primary microphone, pulling it close to my mouth. Just as the tip of Cassidy's pen touched the signature line, I flipped the switch. A massive, deafening screech of audio feedback blasted through the towering speakers, tearing violently through the grand ballroom. The sudden piercing noise caused everyone in the room to flinch. The executives covered their ears, and the orchestra completely stopped playing. Cassidy dropped the gold pen in absolute shock, leaving a dark ink stain spreading across the first page of the contract. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, dead silence. I kept my voice perfectly calm and razor-sharp, allowing it to echo like thunder across the massive room. Before you buy that company, gentlemen, you might want to look at the real balance sheets. I brought my finger down hard on the execute key of my encrypted laptop. Up on the stage, the massive digital projectors suspended from the ceiling instantly shifted. The glowing, elegant logo of the William Commercial Real Estate Group vanished. In its place, a towering 50-foot display of undeniable financial treason illuminated the grand ballroom. The very first image was a high-resolution optical scan of Cassidy's private Cayman Islands trust account. The raw numbers were massive, and they were painted in bright red across the screen for every single person in the room to see. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. The classical orchestra remained completely silent. The only sound in the room was the sudden frantic clicking of 100 camera shutters as the press pool immediately realized they were no longer covering a boring corporate merger. They were witnessing the live public execution of a massive federal crime. Cassidy spun around her silver gown, twisting violently around her ankles. She stared up at the massive screen, her jaw dropping in absolute horror. She frantically waved her arms at the hotel technicians standing near the edge of the stage, screaming at them to cut the power to the projectors. But they could not do a thing. I had completely bypassed their local network and locked the system behind a military-grade firewall. The show was entirely mine to direct. I tapped the spacebar, advancing to the next slide. The screen shifted to display the intricate web of Delaware holding companies. I used bright yellow digital highlighters to trace the massive wire transfers flowing directly from the corporate operating budget into the hollow shell corporations controlled entirely by Trent. I displayed the fraudulent vendor invoices they had used to disguise the theft. I showed the exact dates and the exact amounts, proving a clear, systematic pattern of embezzlement over the last 3 years. The 3 senior executives from the purchasing mega corporation stood frozen at the mahogany podium. They were highly intelligent men who evaluated financial risks for a living. It took them less than 10 seconds to process the data flashing on the screens behind them. They recognized the offshore routing numbers and the fake tax identification codes. Cassidy tried to salvage the situation. She turned back to the executives, a desperate, manic smile plastered across her face. "Gentlemen," she stammered, her voice trembling wildly, "do not look at that. It is a complete lie. It is a fabricated presentation by a disgruntled, estranged relative. We have the official audited reports right here in this binder. Just sign the contract and we can have security remove this disruption. She reached out to hand the heavy gold fountain pen back to the lead executive, but he did not take it. He was staring directly at the third slide I had just pushed to the screen. This slide was the killing blow. It was the high-resolution scans provided by Naomi, the physical internal contracts authorizing the fraudulent property valuations used to artificially inflate the worth of the company before this exact merger. And right there at the bottom of the documents, blown up to massive proportions, were the wet signatures of Cassidy and Trent in unmistakable blue ink. It was absolute, undeniable proof of intent to commit corporate fraud. Down in the crowd, Trent stood completely paralyzed. His eyes were wide with sheer terror as the final slide flashed onto the screen. It was the digital receipt from the wire transfer he had authorized just that morning. $2.5 million sent directly from the corporate reserve account to an illegal Atlantic City gambling syndicate. The board members standing near him physically backed away as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. The lead executive from the global investment firm slowly turned to look at Cassidy. The polite professional demeanor he had maintained all evening was completely gone. His face was flushed dark red with absolute furious indignation. He realized that this woman had looked him dead in the eye, smiled, and confidently tried to rob his firm of $120 million. If he had signed that piece of paper, his own flawless career would have been destroyed, and his company would have inherited massive hidden debts. He looked down at the thick leather-bound merger contract resting on the podium. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen that Cassidy had dropped just moments before. He did not hand it back to her. Instead, he threw it violently across the stage. It hit the polished wood floor with a sharp crack and skidded off the edge into the crowd. "This company is a fraudulent shell," he yelled, his voice booming with rage without the need for a microphone. "You are a criminal, Cassidy. The deal is off." The lead executive signaled to his legal team. Without another word, they turned their backs on Cassidy and marched directly down the stage stairs. Cassidy lunged forward, desperately reaching for the executive's sleeve, but he violently pulled his arm away. "Do not ever contact my firm again," he snapped, before disappearing into the chaotic sea of panicked guests. The grand ballroom instantly erupted into absolute pandemonium. The polite murmurs of the city elite transformed into loud shouts of shock and outrage. The independent board members of the William Commercial Real Estate Group were frantically pulling out their cell phones, calling their personal defense attorneys. They knew federal indictments were going to rain down on the entire corporate structure by morning. The press pool, sensing the story of a lifetime, pushed aggressively against the velvet ropes. Camera flashes fired like rapid strobe lights, capturing every single moment of the spectacular collapse. Through the massive glass window of the control booth, I watched Trent finally break. The arrogant golden boy who had laughed at my $10,000 inheritance was now sobbing openly near the grand staircase. He had his hands buried in his perfectly styled hair, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of his $2.5 million theft. But Cassidy was an entirely different breed of monster. Her initial shock only lasted for a few moments before her sheer narcissistic survival instincts kicked in. She watched the buyers leave and watched her $120 million payday vanish into thin air. But she refused to accept defeat in front of the flashing cameras. She reached down and picked up the microphone the executive had left resting on the mahogany podium. I stepped away from the audio mixing board and walked out of the sound booth. I took the service stairs down to the main floor, keeping my pace incredibly steady and deliberate. By the time I pushed through the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the ballroom, Cassidy was already launching her desperate counterattack. Quiet Cassidy shrieked into the microphone. Her voice was shrill and frantic, echoing loudly over the massive hotel speakers. The sheer volume forced the chaotic crowd to lower their voices. The wealthy guests stopped scrambling for the exits, and the reporters quickly turned their lenses back to the stage, eager to capture her unhinged meltdown live on tape. Cassidy let out a loud, manic laugh, pacing back and forth across the polished wood floor of the stage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the back of the room, searching the dark shadows for me. "So what?" she screamed, her face flushed dark red with absolute furious rage. The merger is dead. Fine. Let them walk away. They are just cowards who do not understand aggressive corporate business tactics. But I still own the company. My name is on the legal charter. I hold 90% of the controlling shares and I sit in the chief executive chair. She gripped the edges of the heavy mahogany podium, leaning forward like a cornered animal preparing to strike. You hear me, Audrey? You thought you could completely destroy me with a few hacked spreadsheets and a slide presentation, but you failed. I still own the 10 luxury skyscrapers in this city. I own the concrete, the steel, and the glass. They are worth billions. I can take out a dozen new loans against those massive properties tomorrow and live like an absolute queen for the rest of my life. You get nothing. You are exactly what you have always been. You are still a broke, jealous orphan, Audrey. I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains and walked directly into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The moment the crowd saw me approaching, they parted like the Red Sea. Men in expensive tailored tuxedos and women in gorgeous designer gowns quickly scrambled to get out of my way, whispering frantically as I walked straight down the center aisle. My black silk power suit caught the bright lights, but my expression remained as cold as ice. I did not look at the flashing cameras. I kept my eyes entirely locked on the desperate woman standing on the stage. Cassidy saw me walking toward her, and her manic, confident smile instantly faltered. "Arrest her!" she yelled, pointing the microphone directly at me. "Security, remove this woman from my private event right now. She is trespassing." A few of the massive security guards shifted uncomfortably near the exits, but absolutely nobody took a single step toward me. They had just seen the undeniable physical proof of her massive federal crimes projected onto 50-foot screens. No one was going to take orders from a sinking ship. I reached the front of the stage and stopped right at the edge of the red velvet ropes. I looked up at Cassidy, letting her desperate, pathetic insults hang in the dead silence of the massive ballroom. I did not even need a microphone to command the space. The entire room was holding its collective breath, waiting for my response. "Are you sure you own them, Cassidy?" I asked, my voice echoing with devastating, absolute calm. Cassidy's eyes darted nervously across the silent room. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice trembling slightly. "I own the buildings. The corporate deed is in my name." I smiled a cold, sharp smile. "Naomi, bring out the documents." Naomi stepped out from the shadows of the stage wings, moving with the lethal elegance of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The deep emerald green of her dress caught the bright stage lights as she walked directly toward me, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished wood floor. She did not look like a subservient employee or a defeated wife. She looked like an absolute executioner. In her hands, she carried the thick, heavy manila folder I had retrieved from safety deposit box 818 deep beneath the city streets. Cassidy stared at her daughter-in-law in absolute bewilderment. "Naomi," she practically spat the name into her microphone, her voice laced with venomous confusion. "What do you think you are doing? Get off this stage immediately. You work for me." Naomi did not even blink. She walked right past Cassidy as if the woman did not even exist. She stopped beside me and handed over the heavy folder. "Actually, Cassidy," Naomi said, her voice projecting clearly and carrying flawlessly across the silent room without the need for amplification. "As the lead corporate attorney, my ultimate fiduciary duty is to the legal owner of the William Commercial Real Estate Group assets. And as of today, that is no longer you." I took the folder from Naomi and pulled out the thick stack of notarized papers. I did not need to hold them up for the crowd to see. I simply tapped a designated key on my laptop resting on the edge of the stage. The massive 50-foot digital projectors instantly shifted away from the evidence of Trent's gambling debts. A new document filled the towering screens behind us, stamped with a massive red state notary seal that was impossible to ignore. The title of the document was printed in bold black letters for the entire world to read: Blind Land Trust Agreement. Cassidy looked over her shoulder at the massive screen and let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. Her mind was desperately trying to reject the reality forming in front of her. A trust, she mocked, waving her hand frantically. "Is that supposed to scare me? My name is on the master corporate deed. I hold the legal charter." A dusty old trust document from 3 years ago does not suddenly override my controlling shares of the buildings. I picked up my microphone, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute authority. You are absolutely right, Cassidy. You do own the buildings. You own every single brick, every pane of glass, and every steel beam of those 10 luxury skyscrapers. But you clearly never bothered to read the foundational property deeds because you were too busy stealing from the operating budget. I began to pace slowly across the stage, addressing the silent, captivated ballroom like a professor delivering a final masterclass in financial destruction. In the world of high-level commercial real estate, there is a very specific legal mechanism known as a ground lease. It means that the physical building and the actual dirt it sits on are classified as two entirely separate legal entities. They can be owned by two completely different people. I stopped and pointed directly at the massive screen behind me. 3 years ago, when my father first realized you were poisoning his company, he quietly severed the land titles from the corporate portfolio. He transferred the absolute ownership of the ground beneath all 10 of those skyscrapers into this irrevocable blind trust. And the sole beneficiary and executor of this trust is me. A massive wave of shocked murmurs swept through the dense crowd. The independent board members looked like they were going to faint. The financial reporters in the room began furiously typing on their phones, instantly recognizing this as the most spectacular corporate trap ever executed in New York history. They understood the catastrophic financial reality of what I was saying. Cassidy's face went completely slack. The arrogant, manic energy drained out of her body in a single instant, replaced by a cold, creeping horror that paralyzed her limbs. "No," she whispered, her voice barely registering over the microphone. "That is impossible. That means your $150 million company does not own a single square inch of the earth it stands on," I said, delivering the words with surgical precision. "You are not a real estate mogul, Cassidy. You are just a tenant. You are renting the dirt from me." The camera flashes erupted in a blinding, chaotic frenzy, capturing the exact moment her empire crumbled to dust. Cassidy looked around the room, her chest heaving as she finally realized she was completely trapped inside a cage built by her late husband. I took one final step toward Cassidy, looking directly down into her terrified, trembling eyes. "And there is one more detail you should probably know about your current tenancy," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly icy whisper that echoed through the grand ballroom. "According to the master contract my father drafted, your corporate ground lease expired tonight at exactly midnight." Cassidy stared at the massive digital screen, her breath catching in her throat. The words "blind land trust" seemed to blur before her eyes. The grand ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of silk gowns as the guests shifted uncomfortably. A ground lease. The concept was terrifyingly simple, but the implications were absolute financial devastation. My father had allowed her to build her entire empire on land she did not actually own. And now the true owner was standing right in front of her holding the master key. I paced slowly across the polished stage, looking out at the sea of shocked faces before turning my attention back to Cassidy. When a commercial ground lease expires, the landowner has the absolute legal right to renegotiate the terms of the tenancy. I explained, my voice steady and unwavering. Or if the tenant has proven to be unreliable, fraudulent, or criminally negligent, the landowner can simply evict them and seize the physical buildings sitting on the property. Cassidy gripped the mahogany podium, her knuckles turning entirely white. "You cannot do that," she hissed, her voice completely devoid of its previous arrogance. "You cannot just take my buildings." "I do not want your buildings, Cassidy," I replied smoothly. "I want my rent. And since you have been occupying my land while simultaneously using it to execute a massive corporate fraud, I have decided to adjust the financial terms of your continued tenancy. As the sole legal owner of the dirt beneath your entire portfolio, I am officially raising the corporate ground rent by 1,000%. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The financial reporters in the front row began whispering frantically to each other, calculating the catastrophic math in their heads. Furthermore, I continued, my voice cutting through the rising noise. Because you have violated the primary covenants of the original lease by falsifying property valuations and embezzling operating funds, the penalty clauses are triggered immediately. Your company owes me $40 million in penalty fees and back rent. And that balance is payable in full right now. $40 million. The number hung in the air like a massive executioner's blade. Trent, who was still standing at the bottom of the stage, let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He knew the corporate accounts were completely drained. He knew they did not even have a fraction of that money available. Cassidy stared at me for a long, terrifying moment. The color had completely drained from her face, but then a strange, frantic energy seemed to possess her. She let out a loud, sharp bark of laughter. The nervous laughter quickly escalated into a manic, hysterical cackle that made the board members physically step away from her. "You really think you are so smart, Audrey?" she yelled, gripping the microphone tightly. "You think you have me completely trapped. But you are just an accountant. You do not understand how real corporate warfare works." She threw her arms out wide, gesturing to the massive, beautiful room around her. "Fine. Raise the rent. Make it $100 million. It does not matter. The William Commercial Real Estate Group is a registered limited liability corporation. If the company owes you $40 million and we do not have the cash, we will simply file for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection tomorrow morning." She sneered at me, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. "The courts will freeze all the assets, the company will fold, and the buildings will go into receivership. I will walk away clean, and you will be stuck fighting a massive army of bankruptcy lawyers for the next 10 years. You get absolutely nothing, Audrey, not a single dime." Cassidy stood there, panting heavily, believing she had just played the ultimate trump card. She thought the corporate veil would protect her personal wealth. She thought she could just burn the company to the ground and retreat to her $15 million mansion in Fairfield County. She thought she was entirely safe. But she had completely forgotten about the woman standing right next to me. Naomi stepped forward and gently took the microphone directly out of my hand. She looked at her mother-in-law with an expression of pure icy calculation. The emerald green of her gown shimmered under the stage lights as she prepared to deliver the final lethal blow. "Actually, Cassidy," Naomi said, her voice ringing out clear and perfectly composed, "you might want to hold off on calling your bankruptcy lawyers." Cassidy narrowed her eyes, glaring at Naomi. "Shut your mouth, you ungrateful traitor," she snapped. "You are fired. You have no power here." Naomi did not even flinch. She just smiled, a cold, devastating smile. "I do not need power, Cassidy. I just need a very good memory. You see, when you and Trent started aggressively draining the corporate operating accounts to fund your lavish lifestyle and pay off his massive gambling debts, you created a severe liquidity crisis. You needed cash to cover your tracks and keep the company looking profitable for the merger." Naomi began to pace slowly, mirroring my earlier movements. She commanded the stage with absolute brilliance. "So you took out massive commercial loans from 3 different private equity banks. And because I was the lead corporate attorney, you trusted me to draft and finalize all the loan agreements. You were always too busy planning parties and shopping in Paris to actually read the legal documents I put on your desk. You just blindly signed wherever I put a little yellow sticky note." Cassidy's manic smile began to fade. A new, deeper level of dread washed over her face. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I did my job," Naomi replied sharply. "Private equity banks are not stupid, Cassidy. They saw the massive risks associated with your loan requests. They required absolute collateral before they would release tens of millions of dollars to your company. So I made sure to structure the agreements exactly the way the banks demanded. When you and Trent signed those loan documents, you did not just sign on behalf of the limited liability corporation. You signed a full, unconditional personal guarantee." The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The independent board members groaned out loud, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of the mistake. Trent fell completely to his knees at the bottom of the stairs, burying his face in his hands. He knew exactly what those 2 words meant. Naomi stated coldly. Naomi stated coldly, "I personally notarized the signatures." "Do you understand what a personal guarantee means, Cassidy? It means the corporate veil is completely pierced. It means bankruptcy will not protect you. Naomi stepped closer, leaning into the microphone so her words would echo in every corner of the room. If the company goes bankrupt tomorrow, the banks will instantly call in the debts. And when the corporate accounts are empty, they will come directly for you. They will legally seize your $15 million mansion in Fairfield County. They will seize Trent's $400,000 Ferrari. They will freeze your personal bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and every single offshore trust you thought was hidden. Cassidy began to hyperventilate, clutching her diamond necklace as she struggled to breathe. And whatever is left over, Naomi concluded, her voice dripping with absolute finality, will go directly toward paying Audrey her $40 million in back rent. You are not going to walk away clean, Cassidy. You are going to walk away with absolutely nothing. You are completely and utterly ruined. The reality of the personal guarantee shattered the last remaining fragment of Cassidy's sanity. For a fleeting second, she just stood there at the mahogany podium, completely frozen as her brain tried to process the absolute magnitude of her destruction. The $15 million mansion in Fairfield County was gone. The offshore accounts she had meticulously padded with stolen money were entirely exposed and subject to federal seizure. She had spent 15 years orchestrating the perfect theft, and her own blind arrogance had led her straight into a legal bear trap. The wealthy guests in the grand ballroom watched in horrified silence. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. The only sound was the rapid mechanical clicking of the press cameras, documenting the exact second the queen of commercial real estate lost her crown. Then something inside Cassidy completely snapped. The polished, elegant facade she had maintained for over a decade violently disintegrated. She let out a guttural, feral scream that echoed terribly over the massive hotel speakers. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. She completely abandoned the podium, throwing herself forward across the polished wood of the stage. Her manicured hands curled into claws as she lunged directly toward my throat. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or raise my hands to defend myself. I knew I did not have to. Before Cassidy could even close half the distance between us, the towering security guards who had refused her orders just minutes ago finally sprang into action. Two massive men in dark suits intercepted her mid-stride. They grabbed her arms and violently wrestled her back away from me. Cassidy fought them with absolute hysterical strength. She thrashed and kicked her expensive silver designer gown, tearing loudly along the seam. Her perfectly styled hair fell into a wild, tangled mess across her face. "Let me go!" she shrieked, thrashing wildly against the heavy grip of the guards. "I will kill you, Audrey! I will tear you apart! You stole my life!" I looked at her struggling helplessly on the stage floor, her expensive diamonds scratching against the wood. "I did not steal anything, Cassidy," I said, my voice perfectly calm and level. "I just reclaimed what you took from me. Now you get to experience exactly what it feels like to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing." The guards hauled her to her feet, ignoring her frantic screaming, and began dragging her forcefully toward the service exit at the back of the stage. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every humiliating angle of her pathetic departure. Down on the main floor at the bottom of the stage stairs, Trent was having a completely different type of breakdown. He was not angry. He was completely consumed by pure paralyzing terror. He was still on his knees, the harsh reality of his financial situation crushing him like a physical weight. The $2.5 million he owed the Atlantic City Sports Syndicate was due by midnight. The federal government was about to freeze every single corporate and personal account tied to his name. The private equity banks were going to seize his $400,000 Ferrari and hunt him down for the remainder of the corporate debt. He was a dead man walking. He had absolutely nowhere to run and nobody left to manipulate. His frantic, bloodshot eyes darted around the room until they finally landed on Naomi. She was standing at the edge of the stage, looking down at him with an expression of cold, indifferent, absolute power. Trent scrambled forward on his knees, his tailored tuxedo pants dragging across the marble floor. He reached up and desperately grabbed the hem of her emerald green dress. "Naomi, please!" he sobbed, his voice cracking pitifully. "Please, you have to help me. You are the smartest lawyer in this entire city. You wrote those contracts. You know the loopholes. There has to be a backdoor or a legal injunction we can file." He looked up at her, tears streaming down his flushed face, his arrogant pride entirely broken. "You are my wife, Naomi. You are my family. You cannot just let them destroy me. The people in Atlantic City are going to kill me if I do not pay them tonight. Please save me. I will do whatever you want. I will change. Just please fix this." Naomi looked down at the pathetic sobbing man clinging to her dress. She did not show a single ounce of pity. She did not reach down to comfort him. Instead, she slowly reached over with her right hand and gripped the massive diamond wedding ring on her left finger. The ring Trent had bought using money he stole from my father's company. She smoothly slid the heavy diamond off her finger. Beside Trent on the floor was the crystal champagne glass he had dropped earlier, miraculously still intact and half full of expensive vintage wine. Naomi held the ring directly over the glass and simply let go. The heavy diamond hit the crystal with a sharp, definitive clink, sinking instantly to the bottom. The heavy diamond settled at the bottom of the crystal champagne glass. The tiny bubbles clung to the pristine metal, creating a stark contrast to the absolute filth of the marriage it used to represent. Trent stared down at the glass, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He simply could not process the terrifying finality of the gesture. He reached a trembling hand toward the rim, but stopped short, completely paralyzed by the sheer crushing terror expanding in his chest. Naomi looked down at him, her posture perfectly straight, and her expression completely devoid of any sympathy or regret. "I filed the divorce papers first thing this morning, Trent," she said, her voice carrying a cold, clinical precision that cut effortlessly through the tense silence of the room. "And because you explicitly signed a full financial disclosure agreement when we got married, I had the absolute legal authority to act on your behalf regarding all our shared assets." Trent shook his head, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What are you saying?" He choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic whisper. "I am saying that I immediately froze every single joint bank account, investment portfolio, and shared trust fund registered under our names," Naomi explained, pacing slightly but keeping her intense gaze locked directly onto his terrified face. "I securely transferred my personal capital into an independent trust that you cannot touch. Then I flagged your recent $2.5 million wire transfer to the Atlantic City Syndicate as highly suspicious fraudulent activity with the Federal Banking Commission." A collective gasp echoed from the wealthy onlookers standing nearby. The independent board members, who were standing just a few feet away, looked at Naomi with a mixture of absolute horror and profound professional respect. They finally realized this woman was a brilliant legal mastermind who had meticulously dismantled her abusive husband's life without breaking a single law. As a result of that federal fraud alert, Naomi continued, her tone completely unrelenting. "The banks initiated an emergency lockdown on your remaining capital. I checked the balance right before I walked out onto this stage tonight. After the total account freeze and the pending overdraft fees from your reckless spending, you have exactly $12 to your name." $12. The number hit Trent like a physical blow to the stomach. He had grown up in a sprawling $15 million mansion. He drove a $400,000 sports car. He wore tailored suits that cost more than most people made in a month. And now, he was entirely destitute. He was a broke, desperate man, with a massive gambling debt owed to a highly dangerous criminal syndicate that would absolutely not take no for an answer. "Please, Naomi," he wailed, the last remaining shred of his dignity completely evaporating into the cold air. He collapsed forward, pressing his forehead directly against the hard marble floor. "You cannot leave me like this. They will kill me. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing left. Please, I am begging you to help me." He sobbed uncontrollably, his shoulders heaving as loud, pathetic wails tore from his throat. It was a completely wretched display. The arrogant golden boy of the William Commercial Real Estate Group was crying on the floor in front of the most powerful business executives in New York City. The press pool showed absolutely no mercy. The rapid clicking of camera shutters filled the air, capturing the total public humiliation of a man who had spent his entire life looking down on everyone else. Naomi did not bend down to comfort him. She did not offer a single word of reassurance. She simply looked over at me, standing near the edge of the stage. We exchanged a brief knowing glance. We were two women who had been treated like absolute garbage by this toxic family, and we had just systematically burned their entire corrupt empire to the ground. Naomi turned her back on her sobbing husband. She picked up her heavy silver pen and her leather clipboard, tucking them neatly under her arm. She walked away from the stage, her emerald green gown sweeping gracefully across the floor, leaving Trent completely alone in the center of the room. The crowd began to murmur loudly, the initial shock finally giving way to frantic, panicked conversation. People were pulling out their cell phones, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the scandal. The independent board members were already heading toward the exits, terrified of being implicated in the massive federal fraud, but nobody was going to leave that room. Before the board members could even reach the grand foyer, a sudden, deafening crash echoed through the venue. The massive, heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom violently burst open, hitting the walls with tremendous force. The chaotic chatter of the city elite died instantly. A dozen men and women in dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers stormed into the room. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs were unmistakable. FBI. Right behind them was a heavily armed squad from the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit. They moved with absolute military precision, instantly securing every single exit and blocking anyone from leaving the grand ballroom. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe expression, stepped forward into the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. He held up a thick stack of warrants, stamped with the red seal of a federal judge. "Nobody moves," he shouted, his voice booming with absolute authority. "We have federal arrest warrants for multiple individuals regarding massive corporate fraud and embezzlement." The tactical team swarmed the grand ballroom with absolute precision. Their heavy boots thudded against the polished marble floors as they moved swiftly through the crowd. The wealthy guests scrambled frantically out of the way, desperate to avoid being caught in the crossfire of the massive federal raid. Two agents immediately surrounded Trent, who was still kneeling helplessly in a puddle of spilled champagne near the edge of the stage. He did not fight back. He simply held his wrists out, sobbing uncontrollably, as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly into place. The golden boy of the William Commercial Real Estate Group was hauled roughly to his feet, his tailored tuxedo wrinkled and stained, looking like a terrified, broken child. But the lead federal agent, a seasoned veteran of the Financial Crimes Division, had his eyes locked on a much larger target. He pushed his way through the panicked crowd, flanked by two armed homicide detectives from the New York Police Department. They headed directly toward the side corridors where the hotel security team had dragged Cassidy just moments earlier. I followed closely behind them, the heavy manila folder from Safety Deposit Box 818 tucked firmly under my arm. This was the moment I had spent 15 years waiting for, and I was absolutely not going to miss a single second of it. The agents found Cassidy in a brightly lit service hallway near the main catering kitchens. She was currently screaming at the terrified hotel staff, demanding a private car to take her back to her mansion in Connecticut. When she saw the tactical vests and the gold federal badges rounding the corner, the color completely vanished from her face. She took a staggering step backward, her ruined silver designer gown dragging heavily across the linoleum floor. The lead agent stepped directly into her path, cutting off her only route of escape. "Cassidy," he barked, his voice echoing sharply in the narrow hallway. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and federal tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." Cassidy shook her head violently, holding her manicured hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. "No," she stammered, her voice frantic and high-pitched. "There is a huge misunderstanding. I did not steal anything. It was all Trent. My son handled all the vendor accounts and the wire transfers. I am just a grieving widow. I had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind my back." She was entirely willing to throw her own biological son under a federal bus just to save her own skin. It was the ultimate terrifying display of her limitless narcissism. I stepped out from behind the wall of federal agents and walked right up to her. "You really have no bottom, do you, Cassidy?" I said, staring directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "But unfortunately for you, the federal government already has your wet signatures on the fraudulent Delaware contracts. You are going to federal prison for a very long time just for the money you stole. But that is not why I brought the local police here tonight. I turned to the lead homicide detective standing next to the federal agent. I handed him the thick manila folder containing the independent toxicology report I had kept hidden all night, Detective. I said, my voice completely steady and clinical. My father, William, did not die of natural causes resulting from his heart condition. He was murdered. And the woman standing right in front of you is the one who killed him. Cassidy gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as her eyes darted wildly toward the heavy folder. Inside that file is an independent toxicology report taken during his final hospital admission, I explained to the detective. It clearly shows a massive, deliberate drop in his prescribed cardiac medication over a period of 3 months. In its place, the private laboratory found lethal concentrations of an unauthorized heavy sedative known to actively suppress heart function. Cassidy was his sole medical proxy. She was the only person with access to his daily pills. She systematically poisoned him so she could take total control of the real estate company before he discovered her massive embezzlement scheme. The detective opened the folder right there in the hallway. He spent a long, tense moment scanning the highlighted medical data and the official laboratory seals. His expression hardened into pure, absolute stone. He closed the folder and looked back up at Cassidy. His eyes held absolutely no mercy. The federal fraud charges were just the beginning. The New York Police Department was now taking primary jurisdiction over a capital homicide investigation. He reached to his thick leather tactical belt and pulled out a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. Cassidy lost whatever fragile grip she still had on reality. She lunged backward wildly, thrashing her arms and kicking her expensive heels against the service carts lining the walls. "You planted that!" She shrieked, thick spit flying from her lips as the detectives forcefully grabbed her wrists. "It is a lie. She is trying to frame me. Let me go!" The heavy steel cuffs clamped down hard around her wrists, locking with a sharp, brutal click that signaled the absolute end of her life. She screamed like a wounded feral animal, her manic shrieks echoing terribly through the entire Plaza Hotel. As the officers dragged her forcefully out the service doors, her perfect facade destroyed forever. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers eventually faded from the tall arched windows of the Plaza Hotel. The chaotic swarm of federal agents, detectives, and panicked billionaires completely dissolved, leaving behind an eerie, heavy silence. The grand ballroom that Cassidy had designed to be the ultimate monument to her own vanity now looked like the aftermath of a war zone. Thousands of imported white orchids were trampled flat against the polished hardwood floor. Abandoned silk jackets and shattered crystal champagne flutes littered the space where the city elite had scrambled over each other, desperately trying to escape the federal raid. I walked slowly back into the massive room, the quiet tap of my heels echoing off the high painted ceilings. I found Naomi standing near the mahogany stage podium, her deep emerald green dress still looking completely immaculate amidst the total ruin. She was looking down at the heavy leather-bound merger contract that had been left behind. The dark ink stain from Cassidy's dropped pen had soaked completely through the thick parchment paper, ruining the fraudulent document forever. Naomi looked up as I approached. She reached over to an abandoned catering table and picked up an unopened bottle of vintage champagne that had somehow survived the chaos. She popped the cork with a soft, satisfying snap and poured the golden liquid into 2 pristine crystal glasses. She handed one to me, her dark eyes reflecting the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. "To the absolute end of an era," Naomi said, raising her glass. Her voice was steady, filled with a profound sense of peace I had never heard from her before. "To the truth," I replied, tapping my glass against hers. The delicate crystal rang out with a clear, sharp note. We drank the expensive champagne, standing alone in the center of the shattered empire we had just brought to its knees. "So what happens now?" Naomi asked, taking another slow sip of her drink. "You own the ground lease for 10 of the most valuable commercial properties in the state. Once the federal court sees Cassidy's corporate shell, the buildings will be locked in receivership. You could easily buy them back for pennies on the dollar and take over the existing property management business." I shook my head, looking around the massive, opulent room. I do not want those buildings, Naomi. They are completely tainted. They represent decades of my father's willful blindness and Cassidy's toxic greed. I am not going to live in the shadow of a hollow empire. I turned to face her, my mind already mapping out the precise logistical strategy. I am going to let the banks completely foreclose on the physical structures. And then I am going to use my leverage as the absolute landowner to order the total demolition of all 10 skyscrapers. I am going to bulldoze every single brick and steel beam into the dirt. I want the ground completely cleared. Naomi's eyebrows rose slightly, but a brilliant calculating smile slowly spread across her face. A complete demolition. That is incredibly aggressive. You are talking about building an entirely new corporate infrastructure from scratch. Exactly, I said, matching her smile. I am going to build a new empire that actually stands for something real. But I cannot do it alone. I need someone who understands the complex legal architecture of commercial real estate. Someone who knows exactly how to navigate the city zoning commissions and draft airtight construction contracts that cannot be exploited. I took a step closer, holding my champagne glass. I want you to be the chief legal officer of my new firm, Naomi. You will have full executive authority, an equal partnership stake, and absolute creative control over the legal department. No more fetching coffee for junior executives. No more enduring racist microaggressions in silence. You will be the second most powerful person in the company, and anyone who disrespects you will be immediately terminated. Naomi looked at me for a long, quiet moment. The heavy burden she had carried for the last 5 years seemed to completely lift from her shoulders. She did not need to think about it. She raised her glass again, a fierce, unapologetic light burning in her eyes. I accept the position. We stood there in the quiet ballroom, sharing a profound moment of reflection. Cassidy and Trent had every possible advantage. They had the money, the connections, and the legal protection of my father's stolen wealth. But they had one fatal flaw that ultimately destroyed them. They completely underestimated us, I said, looking down at the crushed orchids on the floor. Cassidy thought I was just a bitter orphan who lacked the intelligence to understand her financial shell games, and Trent thought you were just a subservient trophy wife who would blindly follow his orders and tolerate his abuse. Naomi nodded, taking a final sip of her champagne. They thought they were invincible because they held all the obvious power. But they never realized that being systematically underestimated is the greatest weapon a woman can possibly have. It makes you completely invisible right up until the exact moment you strike. 6 months later, the bitter winter winds of New York City had finally given way to a bright, optimistic spring. But the change in seasons offered absolutely no comfort to Trent. He stood behind the greasy counter of a heavily trafficked 24-hour diner in the deep industrial sector of Queens. He was wearing a stained polyester uniform that fit him terribly. His hands, which were once manicured and used only for holding crystal champagne flutes, were now raw and covered in burn marks from the industrial deep fryer. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, listening to the relentless shouting of the line cook barking orders at him. The federal courts had completely liquidated every single asset he possessed to satisfy the private equity banks and the massive restitution owed to my company. The Atlantic City Syndicate had seized whatever pathetic scraps remained, leaving him to work off his debt in constant, paralyzing fear. A harsh customer slammed a ceramic coffee mug onto the counter, demanding a refill. Trent flinched instinctively, grabbing the glass pot and pouring the cheap coffee with trembling hands. He watched the wealthy businessmen walk past the diner window in their tailored suits, serving as a painful daily reminder of the life he threw away. He had tried to contact Naomi once, begging for a second chance, but his public defender informed him that she had legally secured a permanent restraining order. He was no longer a golden boy. He was just a ghost of a man, completely broken by his own limitless greed. Miles away from the loud, chaotic diner, Cassidy was experiencing her own custom-built version of hell. She sat rigidly on a cold steel bench inside the maximum security wing of the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution. The luxurious custom silver gowns and borrowed diamonds had been permanently replaced by a stiff, bright orange canvas jumpsuit with her inmate number stamped heavily across the chest. Her perfectly styled hair had grown out, revealing stark patches of gray she could no longer hide with expensive salon treatments. The heavy steel doors of the recreation yard slammed shut, echoing violently through the sterile concrete block. Cassidy stared blankly at the cinder block wall across from her. Her federal trial had been incredibly brief and devastatingly thorough. With the mountain of undeniable physical evidence Naomi and I provided, the jury took less than 2 hours to convict her of wire fraud, embezzlement, and the capital murder of my father. She had been sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. During the entire 6 months she had been incarcerated, she had not received a single visitor. The wealthy elite friends who used to attend her lavish galas had completely erased her from their memories. The sensory deprivation of the prison was maddening. There was no classical music, no imported caviar, and no sycophants to validate her massive ego. She was utterly and entirely alone, trapped forever inside a cage of her own making, while they were drowning in the absolute consequences of their actions. I was standing in the center of the greatest transformation of my life. I wore a bright white hard hat and a sharp-tailored blazer, standing on the edge of a massive excavation site in the heart of the city. The 10 luxury skyscrapers that once stood on this ground had been completely demolished. The heavy wrecking balls had shattered the glass and pulverized the concrete, wiping Cassidy's tainted legacy off the face of the earth entirely. In their place, a massive foundation of fresh steel and poured concrete was rapidly taking shape. The morning sun reflected off the metallic skeletons of the new towers, reaching confidently upward into the clear blue skyline. Naomi stood right beside me, holding a thick roll of architectural blueprints. She pointed to a section of the structural diagram, explaining the new legal zoning permits she had flawlessly secured that morning. She was thriving in her role as the chief legal officer of our new firm, radiating an absolute commanding confidence that nobody could ever diminish again. This new empire was not built on fraud or manipulation. It was built on a foundation of absolute transparency and relentless hard work. I looked away from the blueprints and turned my gaze upward toward the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The chaotic noise of the heavy construction equipment echoed around us, but my mind was completely clear. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, feeling the solid earth beneath my boots. They drove me out to a deserted dirt road 6 months ago and told me I was completely finished. They threw my belongings into the mud and drove away laughing, entirely convinced they had buried me. But they did not understand the fundamental nature of the dirt they left me in. The dirt they left me in was not a grave, it was a foundation. When Cassidy slammed the brakes on that remote Connecticut highway and threw my suitcase into the mud, she thought she was stripping me of my identity. She believed that my worth was somehow inextricably tied to my father's wealth, and without his money backing me, I would simply vanish into obscurity. That is the fundamental flaw of deeply toxic people. They cannot separate their own internal value from the physical things they own, the hollow titles they hold, or the people they can successfully manipulate. Because my stepmother lacked any real substance of her own, she naturally assumed I was just as empty inside. But true power does not come from inheriting a corporate empire or wearing borrowed diamonds to a luxury gala. True power comes from what you can build with your own 2 hands when everyone else has turned their backs on you. Over the last 15 years, I did not just learn how to track complex offshore accounts and corporate money laundering. I learned how to track human nature. I learned that unearned arrogance always leaves a massive paper trail. Limitless greed always makes catastrophic, careless mistakes. And the people who constantly underestimate you are usually the ones who are the most terrified of what you are actually capable of becoming. If there is one crucial lesson I want you to take away from my story, it is this. When toxic family members try to tear you down, do not ever fight back with tears. Do not engage in their loud, dramatic screaming matches or sink to their level of emotional manipulation. Do not waste your precious energy begging for their approval or trying to prove your fundamental worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. Their cruelty is never a genuine reflection of your inadequacy. It is simply a projection of their own deep-seated insecurity and fear. Instead of crying, I chose to calculate. I let them believe they were winning the war. I let Trent strut around in his unpaid luxury sports cars, and I let Cassidy parade her stolen corporate wealth in front of the flashing cameras. I gave them enough rope to completely hang themselves. The most devastating revenge you can ever inflict on a narcissist is to let them build their entire identity on a massive structural lie and then calmly remove the single legal pillar holding it all up. Intelligence, emotional discipline, and absolute patience will always defeat blind arrogance. Naomi and I are living proof of that indisputable fact. We were the women they systematically pushed to the absolute margins of the family. The stepdaughter they maliciously threw away, and the brilliant daughter-in-law they treated like a subservient servant. We were the ones expected to smile politely and take whatever financial or emotional scraps they decided to throw our way. But while they were busy polishing their perfect public image, we were busy studying the exact blueprints of their destruction. We formed a quiet, unbreakable alliance based on mutual respect. And when the time finally came, we did not just break their fragile glass ceiling. We tore down the entire building and legally seized the very ground it stood on. Today, I stand on this massive construction site, not as a victim of my past, but as the sole architect of my future. The cold wind blowing off the river does not bother me anymore. It feels like absolute, undeniable freedom. I look at the heavy steel beams rising into the clear blue sky, and I know that no one can ever take this away from me. I did not inherit this massive empire. I took it back piece by piece using my mind, my education, and my absolute refusal to break under pressure. They drove me to the middle of nowhere and told me it was the end of my road, but they didn't realize they had just given me the open highway. They forced me to navigate the darkness alone, and in doing so, they taught me exactly how to see in the dark. Now it is your turn to take back your power. If you are watching this and you feel trapped by a toxic family dynamic, remember that you are never powerless. Your intelligence, your resilience, and your quiet determination are lethal weapons they can never confiscate. Keep your head down, do the hard work, and prepare for your moment. Have you ever had a family member try to take everything from you? Let me know in the comments below. Hit subscribe for more stories of sweet, calculated revenge. The most profound lesson woven through this story is that being systematically underestimated by those closest to you is never a weakness, but rather the ultimate strategic advantage. When dealing with deeply toxic or narcissistic family members, the natural human instinct is often to fight back loudly. You want to defend your character or beg for the basic respect you inherently deserve. But engaging in emotional warfare with people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you only drains your power and feeds their massive ego. The true victory always lies in emotional discipline and calculated patience. Audrey did not waste her precious energy screaming on the side of that freezing dirt road or throwing a desperate tantrum in the law office when she was handed a $10,000 insult. Instead, she used the silence of being completely ignored to meticulously study her opponents and build an airtight strategy. She understood that toxic individuals are inevitably blinded by their own arrogance. They make incredibly sloppy mistakes while they are busy admiring their own reflections and celebrating their false victories. This story teaches us that true enduring strength is quiet and deeply internal. It is found in educating yourself, building your own independent foundation, and refusing to let your fundamental worth be dictated by people who lack any real substance themselves. You do not need to inherit a glittering corporate empire to be a powerful force in this world, because the absolute greatest asset you will ever possess is a sharp mind and an unbroken spirit. When they try to bury you in the dirt, simply remember that seeds need the dark earth to grow into something magnificent and unshakable. If you have ever had to rise above a toxic environment and build your own success from the ground up, let me know your story in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more empowering content.